Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nina Ignazik. I am the founder and editor of Planet Detroit, and I'm so excited today to have some really great guests on board as we are in the final stretch of days leading up to the election. I know we're all kind of um, getting excited, getting scared, maybe. Somebody said it was kind of like waiting for a biopsy. So we're here to help you understand what's going on with the election in terms of Michigan's environment. Um, you're all watching on different channels, so wherever you're watching, if it's on YouTube, if it's on X or Facebook, you can just type your questions in the comments of that platform, and they will get shuttled to us, and we'll be able to answer your questions. Um, so today we're proud to partner with so many great folks. And Amani Johnson is the statewide manager of Michigan League for Conservation Voters. So we'll meet everybody in a minute, but let's let Amani have the first word. Amani, thank you so much for being here. Um, let's start by briefly sharing with the audience what Michigan League for Conservation Voters feels is at stake in the upcoming election.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. For the first time in decades, we have what we call an environmental majority, but it's really a Democratic majority controlling both the House and the Senate in our legislature. Last year, we saw huge progress on advancing clean energy legislation and addressing climate change. And that legislation will transition Michigan to 100% clean energy by 2040 and create clean energy jobs and help to lower costs for Michiganders. We passed legislation to install water filters in schools and daycare facilities throughout the state to help protect kids and their developing brains from lead poisoning. We also saw funding for water infrastructure and energy efficiency upgrades to our homes and to our businesses. There's still so much more to be done, and we can continue forward and make more progress on protecting our environment and our health while paving a way for a clean energy economy as long as we have the right leadership in place.
Got it. Thanks so much, Amani. So we brought together this group of panelists, and I want to introduce everybody. Today we'll be talking with Sean McBrady. He's the Michigan State Director at Clean Water Action, which works to protect the Great Lakes water ecosystem. So welcome, Sean. Thanks so much for being with us today. We also have Anthony Baber, who is the Communications and Culture Director at Detroit Action. Detroit Action works towards economic and social justice for working class Detroiters. And then last but not least, we have our own Brian Allnut, senior reporter for Planet Detroit, who's been reporting on water, landfills, hazardous waste, energy, and so many other issues in the lead up to the election. So Brian, we're going to start with you and some of your reporting. Let's start with some of the current efforts around Michigan's water and how the election's outcome could impact that. I know there's some legislation on the table that could improve water affordability and address water pollution. Tell us about those things and where things stand.
Yeah, there are several pieces of legislation that environmental advocates hope could be taken up in lame duck following the election, or perhaps in some form next year. And this includes the water affordability legislation that was put forward by State Senator Stephanie Chang. That would create a low-income water affordability fund using a $2 monthly charge for ratepayers. It would also tie water bills to income, add shutoff protections, and help with plumbing repairs. And if this doesn't happen in lame duck, legislation like this would likely need a Democratic majority in order to move forward next year. People I've talked to, Representatives Reggie Miller and Jamie Churches, have also expressed support for some kind of action on water affordability, if not, specifically that batch of legislation. There's also hope that if Harris is elected, she could encourage some action on water affordability. She introduced legislation as a senator that would create a $10 billion fund to offset the cost of water bills in low-income households. And then, in terms of other legislation that people are looking for potentially in lame duck, that could include a bill in the Michigan Senate that would restore the Michigan Department of Environment and Great Lakes and Energy's ability to set water standards. These were rolled back in 2004, and this could allow Eagle to, update standards for discharges from farms and factories. And State Senator Jeff Irwin was saying that legislation could potentially help rein in, PFAS pollution, like from the Tri-Bar facility in Wixom that's been polluting the Huron River and Ann Arbor's drinking water supply. And then finally, there's another piece of legislation, SB 660, that would allow communities to create stormwater utilities, and that could provide financing for both traditional gray stormwater infrastructure, things like pipes, sewers, that sort of thing, as well as green infrastructure, and maybe help municipalities get a handle on the flooding issues that we've been seeing, in recent years. However, there's been some concern that could lead to, affordability issues.
Got it. So, Sean, what's your take on these issues, and especially water protection implications?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot at risk in that area during this election, and as Brian mentioned, and luckily we have reporters like Brian doing a great job bringing these issues out to the press. As he mentioned, there still really is a lot of work to do, especially when it comes to Senator Chang's water affordability package, which is absolutely critical, not just in the Detroit metro region, but statewide, to making sure that we have affordable water. Water is a human right. It's not something that's optional, and it's not something that should be tied to one's economic status. So we have a lot of work to do. And then on top of that, we have the polluter pay bill package that Senator Irwin has really been leading on, that still needs to see action. Lots of other things. And with what we've seen in the last 2 years in Michigan is really great. Here we need as of a few years ago, we were needing an average of $1 to $2 billion annually over the next 20 years just to fix our water infrastructure. And we were investing nowhere near that much before Governor Whitmer came into office. And with the legislature that we've had in the last 2 years, we've really made historic investments in water infrastructure. We're not up to that level that we need of the $1 to $2 billion a year, but we're investing more than we ever have before. And so that's something that's, radically changed in the last 2 years. And that's thanks both to federal investment from the Biden administration and from having the legislature that we have with the first Democratic trifecta in 40 years in Lansing. So we've seen larger investments in water infrastructure than ever before. We had laws that were horrible for the environment, like no stricter than federal, like having what we call the polluter panels overseeing rulemaking at Eagle, that have been repealed. And then we've seen state budget investments in water affordability from the general fund over the last 2 years. Now, those really have funded local assistance programs. We do need the full statewide package, but we've made excellent progress. When it comes to PFAS, at the state level, we've passed really strong drinking water standards for PFAS. At the national level, they've kind of took Michigan took the lead there, but at the national level, we've also been able to get strong water standards for PFAS chemicals. And again, when it comes to PFAS, definitely more remains to be done, but the progress that we've made both at the state and federal level is very much at risk from a Trump White House, or from some sort of a Trump-aligned state house leadership. And right now, we really can't afford to go backwards on these critical water and environmental protections when there's so much more that actually has to be done to address these problems to begin with.
All right, thanks so much, Sean. And I wanted to mention, in case folks don't know, EGLE stands for the state's Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy Agency, which are the state regulators and which lead a lot of this stuff. So, Anthony, I'm sorry I mispronounced your name. Your name is Anthony Baber. Tell us about what you're hearing in the communities that you work with in Detroit. How are folks talking about these issues? What are candidates saying? What's resonating with voters? What's not resonating with voters?
Yeah, and thank you for that. I think that I would absolutely emphasize what Sean was saying. There's been some monumental progress in terms of environmental protections, as far as making sure that our communities are as safe as they can be, and really just looking down the line, starting with water affordability. So many of us are vulnerable to financial setbacks. It's been very uh, it's been very disheartening to see, the situations that a lot of our neighbors end up in, just based on whether they're able to afford water for their homes. And we know that our lives revolve around water. Every step we take, there's some way that we're needing to have clean water, whether it's drinking, whether it's cleaning our bodies, whether it's cleaning our homes. All these things have an impact, and the stormwater utility in particular has definitely been a major sore spot for a lot of the folks that we talk to.
Mhm.
When they get a chance to talk to someone in leadership, very often it ends up being, kind of a game of telephone where they get sent to the next person, who sends them to the next person, who sends them to the next person. And that responsibility shouldn't lie with the people in our communities. Um, the setbacks of having your entire basement flooded and having to figure out what the health ramifications are, what the cost ramifications are. No one has the money offhand to completely restore their basement after
Mm.
it's been destroyed by, some type of disaster. So all of these things really play into the needs that we hear from people. But I think Cleaner Michigan, in particular, in addressing the air and the water quality of our neighborhoods is most important, and making sure we continue to invest in the well-being of our communities and of our neighbors. In every conversation you have with someone around water and air um, being clean, is that they don't know what to do in that situation.
Mhm.
Air purifiers are only going to do so much for you.
Mhm.
Buying bottled water is only setting you back further. There's so many ways that we've already um, put ourselves at a deficit just trying to address these issues. So it's incredibly important that these policies are continually pushed forward, because this is only that first step to make sure that we're being aware of how our communities are affected, but we haven't resolved these problems yet.
No, we haven't. Okay. So, Amani, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the federal investment that's come down. President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 that allocated billions in funding and tax benefits to states for clean energy investments and energy efficiency upgrades. But many regard it as the most significant federal action to address climate change in the U.S. history. What are you seeing in terms of this on the campaign trail, and how is this resonating with voters?
So the Inflation Reduction Act really gets into kitchen table issues that voters care about, lowering costs and creating job opportunities. Before this election, we ran an educational campaign, knocking more than 200,000 doors in Ann Arbor, Oakland County, and also in Lansing, to talk to Michiganders about tax credits and rebates available to them from the Inflation Reduction Act in order to upgrade their homes. And we did this specifically in those communities because they have additional, like the municipalities have additional incentives for folks and resources. We also were, giving presentations to community groups just to try to get this information to as many people as possible. But a lot of people that we talked to didn't know about these programs, didn't know that they were available to them. But the most important takeaway was once they learned about the Inflation Reduction Act, they were more enthusiastic in their support of the policy, but also for President Biden, and wanted to take advantage of these programs. We talk about the issue of climate change as a kitchen table issue, and the solutions are not just going to protect our air and water for future generations, but they'll also help to lower our energy bills and create good paying jobs. In fact, according to a recent jobs report from September, Michigan ranks 3rd in the country for investments in clean energy projects and 4th for clean energy jobs created. And for voters who care about the economy and jobs, Democrats should be pointing to the IRA and the benefits that they can take advantage of as a key economic driver.
Got it. I think a lot of people don't understand what it means at this point still too. So thank you for explaining that. Brian, before we wrap up the section on and coming back to water, we wanted to touch on one of the races that we've been hearing about, and that is between the Oakland County and Macomb County local water commissioner races. What's happening with these races? What's at stake?
Yeah, so Oakland County Water Resources Commissioner, Democrat Jim Nash, is up for re-election, as is Macomb County Public Works Commissioner, Republican Candace Miller. And so both of them are, probably favored to win those races. And, while neither one of them has direct control over state policy, like Senator Chang's water affordability legislation, they have taken stances on it, and Nash has been a strong supporter, which some say is really significant, considering he's in Oakland County and they haven't always supported services for low-income folks there. So he's kind of played a important role in that conversation. And Miller, in contrast, has really pushed back on that legislation, and she wants communities to be able to opt out of the $2 charge that would create the Water Affordability Fund.
Got it. All right. We're going to move on to talking a little bit more about energy and climate now. And we'll start with Anthony. Anthony, what policies around energy are drawing the attention of working class voters in Detroit? What's the conversation around this?
Yeah, when I think of energy, the first thing that always comes to mind for me is the annual DTE rate hike, which I feel like we see routinely. And it genuinely blows my mind that a utility company can have carte blanche on setting new rates while having the worst outages in the Midwest, almost in the entire country. And so my priorities really align with the Taking Back Our Power campaign, stopping DTE and consumers from making political contributions firstly, and getting consistent accountability in place for a utility that has not shown enough goodwill to its customers. Um, I think it also, speaks to how monopoly can really suck the state dry based on what resources we have and how we're able to actually push back. And I'd love to see more of that from the MPSC as well. But past that, I'd also like to see local solar power collection and storage expanded. I feel like that's one of the issues that we hear from people really often is, when can I have some solar panels on the roof of my house? When do I get to have more of a stake in what renewable energy is? But more than that, the engagement on actually educating folks on how they can be involved, on what having renewable energy means for us and how it will influence the rest of the state. And so those are especially important, but getting corporate money out of Lansing still remains most important to me.
Got it. And Sean, what potential changes at the state level this election could impact the legislation around some of the issues that Anthony mentions here, whether they're just being discussed, whether there's proposals, and what races could impact how they're implemented?
Yeah, well, I think Anthony brought up a really key point. With Clean Water Action, we were actually also a member with Detroit Action of the Taking Back Our Power coalition. And when it comes to energy, two of the biggest problems we have in the state of Michigan are DTE and Consumers Energy. Now, these companies are, regardless of which party controls the state legislature, DTE and Consumers are regularly, if not the largest, two of the largest funders to our state elected officials, and they run monopoly utilities and they run them poorly. We have several examples throughout the state, including in the Metro Detroit area, of course, in Wyandotte, where they have a public utility. And guess what? With the public utility, they're paying less money. They also have fewer outages, and their outages don't last anywhere near as long as the several weeks that some people have been out this year and in the recent past with DTE power outages. So, really what's the solution to the energy problem here is ensuring that companies that profit off of the current energy system don't have a huge role in determining what steps we take next. And the only way to do that is by taking away the insane money advantage that they have on our political process. And so the Taking Back Our Power coalition, is working to address that through legislation that would stop DTE and Consumers, but also all monopoly utilities and all government contractors from donating to not only political candidates, but also their PACs, super PACs, 501c4s, et cetera. Getting something like that passed will really open the floodgates of our ability to address the climate crisis. Because another thing Anthony mentioned, community solar, something we desperately need. There's so many spots in our state where people would really like to take advantage of all the benefits that come with solar energy. Not just the environmental benefits, but the reliability benefits, the cost benefits, et cetera. And they're not in a position to do that because we don't actually have community solar. Why don't we have community solar? DTE and Consumers don't like competition, so they've stopped it from being brought up in the legislature, or stopped it from passing at least so far. There's a lot of work to be done to defend, again, the progress that we've made when it comes to energy and climate, but also there's these steps that we really have to take if we actually want to address the climate crisis. Another thing that really concerns me that this election could impact is in the climate legislation that was passed last year, there are numerous off-ramps that utilities can take if they're having issues with increased load on their grids, where they'd essentially be able to build new gas plants and call it clean energy. And we have this issue, I think we're going to get into a bit here, with data centers in Michigan, where if we don't actually regulate data centers and make sure that they are being powered with renewable energy on site, we are going to be in a position where they're creating such a huge load on our grid that it might allow some of these utilities to exercise the off-ramps in that legislation. Mm-hmm. And then no matter how much we may want to call gas clean energy, it's not. Gas is fossil fuel energy. It's contributing to the climate crisis. It also contributes to the affordability crisis. It's much more expensive than clean energy sources like wind and solar in the direction that we ought to be going in. So, again, there's just so much at risk. And then so many of the key districts, including in just in the Detroit metro region, Representative Jamie Churches, has been an advocate for the Taking Back Our Power legislation, as well as Representative Mai Song in Macomb County. We have some people in these swing states, and some candidates as well are supporting, like Janice O'Neill Robinson, who's also running in a downriver seat. We have these candidates and current elected officials who really have showed up for their constituents. And we're very hopeful that they come back to the legislature after this election, because those are the kind of people that we need to help get something like this across the line.
Got it. And you mentioned gas plants, and I know that nuclear is also coming up. I think was something that we're going to be addressing uh, probably sooner than any of us thought next year. Um, Amani, there could what do you see happening in terms of some of these federal funding laws that have passed over the last 4 years? The IRA, but not only the IRA, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and energy transition. What are you seeing on that?
So, as we've stated a couple of times, under President Biden, we saw the most significant action in our country's history to address climate change, boost our country's transition to clean energy, and invest in infrastructure. We've already seen attempts in Congress to undo important parts of this legislation. And under a Trump presidency, this policy is certainly at risk this election cycle. Another important policy that's been called out specifically by Trump in his Project 2025 plan is gutting federal PFAS standards that were just finalized last year. And this, for the first time ever in our history, set limits on PFAS contamination in drinking water from the national level, which will help protect people all across this country. But industrial polluters have already tried to file lawsuits against these standards, and a polluter-friendly president in the White House would definitely put them at risk. As for the IRA, Donald Trump has been a loud and proud supporter of fossil fuels and oil drilling, and we could expect that if he gets elected, he would carry out policies that allow for more of this, which would jeopardize our climate progress. And the good news is that here in Michigan, the clean energy progress we've made is really strong. People are seeing the economic impacts and benefits with new jobs as we continue to grow our own build out of clean energy, and we'll see the cost savings on our energy bills as well. As more and more people take advantage of the IRA and these tax incentives and credits and rebates for home energy upgrades, it'll be hard for a sitting president, no matter what party, to go against America's pocketbook.
Okay, and getting back down to the local level, Brian, you've been out on the campaign trail a little bit, covering some local races, some state races. What are you seeing? What are some of the ones that we should be watching and that we are watching?
There's kind of a handful of state level races that could really determine who controls the Michigan House next year. And Sean mentioned some of these, but one of them is Democrat Reggie Miller's contest against Republican Dale Benecke in the district that includes Belleville. Also, Jamie Church's race against Riley Linning in the Downriver area, and Democrat Jen Hill's race against Republican Carl Bonak in the Upper Peninsula. And I think one thing that's notable about these is the Democratic candidates really seem to have been outspoken on environmental issues so far. It made them a part of their campaign, seeming to bet that even in a competitive district, this could be a winning issue with voters. And so, for example, as Sean mentioned, Jamie Churches has supported the Taking Back Our Power campaign. She also supports the polluter pay legislation. And both Miller and Churches have pushed back on the data center bills. And then, at the national level, some of the kind of more competitive races are Democrat Alyssa Slotkin's race against Republican Mike Rogers for the open Senate seat, and then Democrat Curtis Hertel's race against Republican Tom Barrett. And those are also the kinds of elections that could decide control of the U.S. House and Senate next year, and the fate of investments in climate and in infrastructure through things like the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law that Project 2025 has kind of targeted for rollbacks. Whether that is something that will realistically happen or not, I don't know, but it would definitely seem to be less likely if Democrats were able to maintain control of the House and Senate, even if Trump becomes president.
All right, thanks, Brian. And I would be remiss if I didn't encourage everybody to check out Brian's reporting at planetdetroit.org. He's covered some of these races already and has some good detail and more to come. All right, Amani, I want to follow up on that with you, but Anthony and Sean, please feel free to jump in. How are these issues we're discussing coming up in these campaigns that could make or break some of our protections? I think Amani, start with you.
Okay. In Michigan, water is in our DNA. It defines us, and we're really seeing candidates break through when they talk about the work they've done or will do to protect our drinking water and our Great Lakes and hold polluters accountable. People are concerned about contamination in communities. We talk about it a lot on doors, no matter where we are, downriver, Macomb County. We saw the huge public outcry when we learned about radioactive waste coming to Belleville. Candidates that have a plan or a track record of addressing these issues, especially at the local level, are breaking through with voters. We also have an energy reliability and affordability problem here in Michigan. People are sick and tired of the constant power outages and rate hikes from DTE Energy and consumers almost every year. And as we've been talking to voters, holding utility companies accountable for improving our energy reliability and lowering energy costs are issues that are top of mind. It's probably the most popular topic of conversation between myself and voters and folks out in the community. And there's a growing number of lawmakers who are taking a stand against the big utility companies, and we look forward to meaningful action on holding them accountable if Democrats are able to retain power.
Okay, Sean or Anthony, anything else you want to add and jump in?
Yeah, I'm thrilled to see lawmakers and candidates like Jamie Churches downriver, as well as folks like Betsy Kafia, who we've endorsed up in the Traverse City area, Jen Hill in the UP that you mentioned, and so many others in tight races running on things like holding polluters accountable, which every time we've polled polluter pay and holding polluters accountable, it's broadly popular. We're talking, this was polling over 90%, as well as, the taking back our power legislation that we discussed to hold utilities accountable. That polls over 80%. These are broadly popular issues. And I think that representatives and candidates who are running on these issues are really showing that they're listening to their constituents and that they're, listening to the people that they're supposed to represent and standing with them. These are issues that really, and the water issues as well. Water affordability has always been an issue that polls very, very well, and it cuts across party. Everybody realizes we need clean water to drink. Nobody wants contaminated. Nobody likes the fact that we have 27,000 contaminated sites across Michigan, and in almost half of the cases, the polluters have frankly gotten away with it, and now the state has to clean up the mess. Nobody likes the fact that the power goes out here as frequently as it does, and rates are as high as they are, while utilities spend money, donating to politicians, which is cheaper than investing in their grid. So I'm really encouraged by the fact that we have such great candidates connecting with their constituents and running on these broadly popular issues that receive such significant support in their communities.
Okay, we are about halfway through, and I want to make sure that everybody watching on whatever platform you're watching on knows that you can just post a comment to whatever platform you're on, if it's YouTube or Facebook or X or whatever. We will see them, and we'll try to answer them. So please, feel free to try to get into the conversation here. Less than kind of related to the energy issue, Brian, EVs have become a bit of a wedge issue. There was a really good Politico article that you sent me yesterday kind of describing that. It's come up in Michigan in the Mike Rogers, Alyssa Slotkin race. What are you seeing in terms of those, and what, as far as the voters you've talked to, what are people saying about that kind of wedge issue about EVs?
Well, yeah, that's the thing, is that I think, at least at the state level, I haven't seen a lot of candidates really talking about it, or heard, voters talking about it. But it is an issue in that Senate race. And I spoke with the Michigan pollster Bernie Porn, and he said that he feels like Democrats are, essentially failing to explain what the benefits of EVs are, and that could potentially weigh on the Senate race. Mike Rogers has said that these are going to be a job killer, and the research doesn't really seem to support that. The research seems to show that EVs would likely create about as many jobs as gas-powered cars, or maybe more. But opinions about EV manufacturing could be hampered by the fact that a lot of Michiganders don't really see them as practical, and have said that they wouldn't consider buying one, according to a poll from the Detroit News. Polling has also shown a strong partisan split, with Democrats saying they think EVs are going to be good for the economy, and Republicans saying they're going to be bad. So that's definitely weighing on the issue. I think the other piece of that is that, although research seems to support the idea that EVs could create more jobs, a lot of those jobs are in battery plants that aren't currently unionized. So, that could be adding to the anxiety that some people have about these in Michigan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. We're gonna stick with you, Brian, but shift topics a little bit. You've been covering a lot of public meetings and issues related to hazardous waste and landfill in Michigan. What can you just start by framing that issue for us? What's happening, what's next, and how you see it playing out in the election?
Yeah, so a lot has been happening, and it's kind of hard to keep up with. Most of us probably remember last year we were dealing with contaminated soil and liquids from the East Palestine rail disaster that got sent to Wayne County, and causing a big public outcry. And then in August, we learned that waste from the Manhattan Project was coming to, one of the same facilities that the East Palestine waste got sent to, Wayne Disposal in Van Buren Township. And that took many elected officials by surprise.
Mm-hmm.
It's since emerged that that site's been receiving hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of radioactive material from different sites managed by the Army Corps of Engineers since 2017. And where things kind of stand now, an injunction has temporarily blocked waste from the Niagara site, which was the first site that was reported on in August, but not from, I think at least 11 other sites is the last count that I had on this, that are all Army Corps sites associated with the Manhattan Project. So the waste is still coming in. Rep. Reggie Miller introduced legislation in September to ban the dumping of elevated radiation waste from both in-state and out-of-state sources in Michigan. And then State Senator Darren Camilleri just announced additional legislation to ban the creation of new radioactive and hazardous waste injection wells. There's one of those in Romulus.
Mm-hmm.
And the creation of hazardous waste facilities in densely populated areas or within 100 miles of another hazardous waste facilities.
So, Anthony, why is this issue so important to those in the Metro Detroit region? What are the dangers? What are people worried about? How could this or is this impacting health?
Well, I want to start off by sending love to the people still dealing with the fallout of the East Palestine derailment.
Mhm,
I've spoken to organizers from East Palestine and from surrounding towns, and I think the thing that's so unsettling about it is that there are so many long-term effects that we're not even aware of yet. And because this story isn't, going to stay at the top of the news for years to come, it can very easily be kind of washed away, and we don't we don't have an immediate kind of issue to point to say like this is what the impact of that hazardous waste has been. But
mhm,
let's not forget that it wasn't long after that derailment that a train in Michigan derailed in very similar fashion, and for a bit there was a lot of renewed discussion not only around hazardous waste but also the method of transportation we're using for it. Um, a train system that is, over a century old and rarely is getting the repairs or the updates that are needed to make sure that we can get the get the materials moved to where they need to be. But then you get to the issue of where are these materials being moved? Why are they being brought into our neighborhoods, into our cities? And again, it really comes back to what care and concern is being applied to the long-term effects. Um, when a disaster occurs, safety and well-being of those who are anywhere nearby should be the first thing that comes to mind.
mhm,
But more often, it becomes a a concern of how do we make sure that this doesn't become a bigger story than it is.
mhm,
And from this point, like that attitude has only made it more difficult to be aware of how we should be thinking about landfills, how we should think about factories, how we should think about demolition zones, like any area where your water or air can be affected by industry or debris or any other outside factor. There has to be a greater discussion about who that affects and how it will affect them for 10, 20, 50 years into the future. And so that's the biggest thing that comes to mind. How we don't get to pick and choose who we care about.
mhm.
We have to look at who's being affected, who's most vulnerable, and how we can actually be mindful of creating a safer and more appealing place to live for all of our neighbors and all of our community members, and not just downtown.
Sean, why has it been so difficult for Michigan lawmakers to act on this issue of reducing trash imports, hazardous waste imports into Michigan? And is there anything to indicate that people are looking at this any differently?
Yeah, I think luckily, the fact that we're receiving radioactive waste in Belleville from the Manhattan Project seems to have gotten to the press and gotten people, gotten people riled up a little bit about this issue. And one of the reasons why this has been so hard for Michigan lawmakers to deal with, um, although so we dealt with it partially back in 2006 with raising the tipping fees. Um,
Mhm,
and but we haven't raised the tipping fees really since then, and so we're again we have the lowest tipping fee in the region by far. And for tipping fee briefly is what they're charging to dump waste in landfills, and waste is considered an article of commerce, so you can't ban out of state waste due to NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. You can't ban Canadian waste because again considered an article of commerce from crossing the border. The only way you can limit and reduce the amount of waste being dumped in Michigan right now is by raising the tipping fees and putting them more in line with what we have in other states and what we have
mhm.
in Canada. And that would minimize the importation of all types of waste into Michigan. And I think Representative Miller, who y'all have mentioned Belleville is in her district, she has really been a leader on this. This is an issue that she's taken on. She's got legislation that I'm hoping will come up for a vote here after the election during lame duck. But Representative Miller is, in a important race right now with the election, and she's also just fighting tooth and nail for her people and for all of us. It's not good for anybody who relies on the Great Lakes that we're dumping radioactive waste next to 1/5 of the world's fresh water. What could go wrong, right?
Brian, you've been covering the Miller race. You talked a little bit about it. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think I was just going to respond to something Anthony said. First, he mentioned that just this whole issue of where we're sending the waste and who lives there, I think is really important and something a lot of people are bringing up. And with the radioactive waste, the Army Corps said that Wayne Disposal is one of 5 sites that can receive this kind of material. And it's the only site east of the Mississippi. So there's clear economic, logistical sort of motivations to send it to this place, especially when so many of these sites are in the eastern US. But, but it's also in Michigan's most populous county. And the 4 other sites are in very sparsely populated areas in places like Texas and Utah. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. But yeah, in terms of what is happening, Reggie Miller is putting forward this legislation, and she believes that she can get around that Supreme Court decision that essentially classifies waste as a commodity by highlighting the public health and safety concerns. So I think she thinks there's a workaround there. And I think it could help her in her district. Definitely people I've talked to in the district are very concerned about this. I think it's just a question of whether, she can pitch it and she can capitalize on her support for action on this. Her opponent, Dale Benecki, has criticized her for not knowing the waste was coming, although she was far from the only person who was surprised by this. And Eagle has said that there's, no real requirement for them to alert elected officials about this. Whether or not something could happen on the issue if Democrats lose the majority is unclear, but Miller did suggest to me that there's kind of enough anger about this issue that that Republicans might still want to move on it because there's been such an outcry. I think it gets trickier when it comes to some of these other questions, which, radioactive waste is just part of this. There's, landfill hazardous waste, there's liquid hazardous waste, and then there's just a ton of landfill garbage that are coming into the state that, a lot of people want to see less of or ban altogether. Darren Camilleri introduced a bill in June to raise the tipping fees for liquid hazardous waste, and that hasn't advanced. Governor Gretchen Whitmer was backing a proposal to raise the landfill tipping fee to $5 from a ton from 36 cents earlier this year, and that didn't make it into the House budget. So clearly, it's still going to be an uphill battle to kind of rein in the waste that's coming into the state.
Got it. And Amani, before we jump to audience questions, can you give us just a quick rundown about what comes after Election Day? We're all hoping we get there as we move into lame duck. And then I invite the rest of the panel to weigh in after Amani. And we do have some audience questions we want to get to, so maybe make your responses concise.
Of course. We're all very much looking forward to Election Day.
Yes.
We are expecting a really active lame duck, regardless of the outcome of the election. During election years, the legislative calendar is shorter, so we actually have quite a bit to pack into a shorter period of time. But we expect legislation that would give tax breaks. This has been mentioned a few times to data centers to come up again, as we saw in September. This legislation in its current form isn't strong enough and would result in additional fossil fuel capacity, which would interfere, with our climate goals here in Michigan. There's also a package of bills that would address Michigan's water affordability, which has also been mentioned, that hasn't been able to get across the finish line just yet. Legislation to reinstate polluter pay laws so that polluters are fully held accountable for paying to clean up the messes that they create. And Michigan's new energy laws just coming online and into effect. They're just coming online and into effect. So we expect clean energy progress to continue through the new year, with new clean energy projects coming online and more Michiganders taking advantage of these incentives in their homes and in their businesses, and making these energy efficient upgrades. And outside of the election cycle, we have a full-time legislature. We still have a full-time legislature that will finish out the year and pick back up next year. So you can get involved by contacting your lawmaker, reaching out to them, making sure they know what issues are important to you.
All right. Anything else anybody wants to add before we move to audience questions? All right. We have a question here. Do we have faith in Elissa Slotkin to be a climate champion in the Senate? This person is not fully convinced. Anyone want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'll take a shot on it. So Clean Water Action has endorsed Elissa Slotkin for the U.S. Senate, and digging into Representative Slotkin's background a little bit. When she was a national security expert, one of the main things that she did was figuring out how to address climate change at U.S. military bases around the world. She has such a unique perspective on climate, not just as an issue that's affecting all of us here at home, but as a national security issue. Elissa Slotkin has, come out opposed to the Line 5 pipeline because of the national security implications of having, a pipeline pumping 23 million gallons of oil a day at the bottom of the Great Lakes, and the potential national security threats there. And the fact that our drinking water and, 1/5 of the world's fresh water ought to be a national security priority. Representative Slotkin also, uniquely really among U.S. Senate candidates, she does not take corporate PAC money. She's, been really on the side of transparency. She's been somebody who we can definitely work with and count as a champion on these issues in the United States House. We expect to see that continuing in the Senate. And I'd like to also just speak about her opponent, Mike Rogers, who, got to Congress here in the Lansing area where I am after getting Rogers Law passed when he was the Senate Majority Leader in the state Senate before that. Rogers Law disenfranchised tons of Michigan State University students and made it harder for them to vote on campus. That's how he got to U.S. Congress to begin with. He also twice, once in the state legislature, once in U.S. Congress, voted to allow oil drilling in the Great Lakes. That's just what we need: a Deepwater Horizon, Lake Superior. So Slotkin is not only a climate champion by her own rights, but when compared with Mike Rogers, who's funded by the oil companies, votes for big oil, he's going to be drill baby drill just like Donald Trump. It's not even close.
Yeah, if I can add to what Sean's saying,
Mhm.
I think there's always room to challenge a candidate on whatever issues that you find most important. But it's also important to remember that perfect can be the enemy of good. And we know, especially based off what Sean's just given, that Elissa Slotkin actually champions environmental rights. And that when you're in a fight against someone who is the extreme opposite of that, from a strategic point of view, you really have no choice but to at least work with that candidate, because Elissa Slotkin is far closer to envisioning the future that we hope for than Mike Rogers is. And if we take the setback that comes with Mike Rogers in Congress, then essentially we're asking to double up the work that's going to come later. And so, strictly from a strategic standpoint, you don't have to like the person, but if you have trust in them aligning with your values, that's the candidate you should throw your weight behind.
Got it. All right. We have some other questions, and I just want to we still have a few minutes. So if you have a question and you're watching, throw your question in the comments on whatever platform you're watching on, and we will have those. This is a topic we haven't talked about. What about invasive species for sale in Michigan? Is that something anybody here has worked on or heard about? All right. Well, that is one that we will address in our reporting in the future. We have another question about, we alluded to it before. Google and Amazon now purchasing modular factory-built nuclear reactors. Where are we in Michigan? We talked about hazardous waste and radioactive waste disposal. Where are we policy-wise with this, and what can we expect? Anyone want to jump on that one?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. So, part of why Google and Microsoft and Meta, et cetera, all the big tech companies are starting to buy energy facilities, including, Microsoft recently purchasing 3 Mile Island with hopes of reopening the nuke plant there. These plans to reopen the Palisades plant here in Michigan, which, again, what could go wrong? A plant that was shut down, that's outdated, and right on the shores of Lake Michigan. We're risking folks in that community. We're risking our water for these things. Part of why big tech is now getting into the energy game, and specifically the nuke game, is because of the need for so many new mega data centers that is driven largely by AI, by cryptocurrency. That's why we're seeing this need for larger and more data centers. And as we kind of get into the data center issue here in Michigan, data centers are such huge energy users that the nuclear power that tech companies are looking at are basically to power those data centers. They're also, they also become some of the largest water users in a community when they come in, because these data centers use evaporative cooling, where they're using, between 2 and 5 times the amount of Nestle's water withdrawal that everybody rightfully opposed back in 2016. And so we really need to find a way to address energy not only on the supply side but on the demand side, and making sure that when it comes to things like data centers, we're responsibly regulating these and making sure that they're using energy from actual clean renewable sources like wind and solar, not risky sources like outdated nuke plants and reopening them.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think one thing that's interesting about this, although the data center issue kind of took a lot of lawmakers by surprise when it first came up, they're learning about it. Some of them are becoming more skeptical about providing tax breaks for these facilities that are, some of which are run by some of the world's largest, wealthiest companies. They would be getting tax breaks. But also we're starting to see examples of what happens in other states, with these facilities when there aren't adequate environmental guardrails in place. And so Sean mentioned the 3 Mile Island thing, but then also, I reported on the Virginia data centers where, perhaps the largest conglomeration of data centers in the country. These facilities need to have these massive diesel generators, which could be a major air quality problem in Michigan, especially considering the fact that our power supply is so unreliable. So I think those are the kinds of things that that legislators could be taking a closer look at as they consider this, probably in lame duck when it's going to come back up, I think.
All right. Well, we are right a minute to the hour. So we're not going to take any more questions, but thanks everybody for watching out there. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today for your time and your insights. We really appreciate you, and we will be tapping you very, very much so in the future as we continue to report on these issues at Planet Detroit. All right. Thanks so much.